channel. Welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forums Fall Series. As I noted at the beginning, this is our 100th lecture, and we're thrilled to have our speaker tonight. I couldn't think of anyone more deserving or worthy. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking a question. We'll go to about 9 p.m. New York time, so total time is an hour. Second, donations are always appreciated but never expected. There is a donate tab on the website. Third and finally, as I mentioned, we have a YouTube channel, and this talk will be uploaded to it shortly after the end of the presentation. There's an icon at the top of the website where you can access the YouTube channel. And fourth and finally, any feedback, good, bad, or otherwise, you can send through the website at www.iidf.org. Now this evening's speaker, and candidly someone who's, this is an encore of an encore. Hal has been with us 3 times. Absolutely thrilled to have him back. He's going to speak on the 3rd volume of his Blue versus what we call the Naval War College trilogy. And let me give him an appropriate introduction. Hal Friedman is professor and chair of modern history at Henry Ford College. He's the author of Governing the American Lake, the U.S. Defense and Administration of the Pacific, 1945 to 1947, Arguing Over the American Lake, Bureaucracy and Rivalry in the U.S. Pacific, 45 and 47, and Digesting History, the Naval War College, the Lessons of World War II and Future Naval Warfare, among many other works, including this trilogy, this Naval War College trilogy. He's already spoken on the first 2 volumes for our for previous lectures here at the World War II Discussion Forum. Tonight, he's going to address the Blue versus Purple, which is the 3rd volume of the trilogy, and which is about the wargaming activities of the Naval War College in the late summer and fall of '46 in Newport, Rhode Island, and particularly at the beginning of the Cold War, how it impacted Naval War College in terms of changing its focus from Japan to the Soviet Union as the primary enemy in the Pacific Basin. Like I've read before, the reviews have been fantastic. Many people have said it's an extremely well-researched and necessary piece of scholarship for everyone to have on their shelves. I think you'll see from this presentation tonight, as well as the previous ones, and the link I provided, that it's really just a wonderful work in terms of the level of detail and knowledge that Hal brings to it, and we're thrilled to have him. And with that, I will turn over to Hal, and I will manage the slides. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks everybody for having me back. Yeah, this is the 3rd in a trilogy, so just to review really quickly, the first in the trilogy, Digesting History, was just a general look at the Naval War College between 1945 and 1947. I took those first 2 years from the end of the war to basically the beginning gelling of the containment doctrine as American foreign policy. And I looked at the college in general about who the students were, who the instructors were, what the staff was doing in terms of lecturing to the students. And we can go with the first slide, Greg, if you don't mind. What
1 minute,
what
Hal.
they were. Okay. What the instructors were having the students read, what they were lecturing to the students, the kinds of guest instructors, guest lecturers that were showing up to the college, and how the college was trying to really digest the lessons from the Second World War, especially in the Pacific, since that was the Navy's primary theater, but in the Pacific as well. We're having a little bit of a technical problem, so we should be coming up with the first slide soon. Yeah, there we go. Second book was called Blue versus Orange, and it was the Naval War College from 1945 to 1946. When the war ended so suddenly, Vice Admiral William Pye, the president of the college, and his staff really couldn't rewrite the curriculum for that year based on anything that they were experiencing in terms of the U.S. meeting a potential post-war enemy. So Orange, or Japan, the Naval War College color-coded countries, Orange continued to be the primary hypothetical enemy. And a lot of the exercises, but not all of them, reflected late Pacific War experience by the Navy, with a lot of attempt by Pai and his staff to bring logistics into study, which had not occurred a lot in the interwar period. Um, with 1946, 1947, for the first time, a number of things are happening. There is first the ability to go back. Let's go down one more, if you don't mind, one more slide. Or one more advance. Yeah, there we go. Oh, no, back one. Yeah, there we go. There's the Naval War College in 1946. And a number of things are happening. First, nationally and to the military, there are massive budget cuts between the summer of 45 and the summer of 47. In the summer of 1945, there are 12.1 million men and women, mainly men, on active duty in the military, and the military is consuming 80% of the entire federal government's budget. By the summer of 1947, there are 1.6 million men and women, again, mainly men on active duty, and the military budget is 25% of the federal budget, which is very large compared to what the military had had before World War II, but nothing like it had had during the war. And the military institutionally, not just the Navy, was experiencing the fear that it might be going back to the starvation times of the 1920s and 1930s, when budgets were extraordinarily slim. This is Harry Truman and Congress attempting to deal with something that politicians don't really attempt to deal with much anymore, and that is something called the national debt. Truman was sincerely worried that the national debt was going to derail the U.S. economy, and he later, like Dwight Eisenhower, was beginning to realize that the U.S. economy, was really the primary weapon by which to fight the Cold War against the Soviets rather than military force. So that meant everybody taking budget cuts. And the Naval War College, it actually not only had an impact there in 1945, 1947, it had an impact on my research. In the 1920s, 1930s, when the Naval War College did war games, they had written critiques. There were verbal critiques by the staff of the students when the war game was over with. But these verbal critiques were written down and recorded. That did not happen between 1945 and 1947, at least as far as I could tell. There simply wasn't the clerical staff at the college to do this, so there were strictly verbal critiques rather than written ones. The two books, Blue versus Orange and Blue versus Purple, probably would have been very different if I'd had different sources. If you look at the books, they are very, very narrative, close to the sources, even plotting narratives of what the students were doing in terms of their war games. If I'd had written critiques, the books would have revolved around those critiques and what the students were doing in that context. So interesting how something that happened 80 years ago had an impact on me when I was writing these books. There was also a problem with sources at the Naval War College, because Dr. Evelyn Sherpak, who was a longtime curator, told me once that before the curators became the curator and the assistant curator became civilians, the keeper of the archive at the Naval War College was a lieutenant who had come up from the enlisted ranks, had been about 45 years in the Navy, and saw it as his duty, as his last duty station, to quote unquote clean up the archives. So a lot got thrown out, and I'm not even sure what got thrown out in the 1960s. So there may have been written critiques, but they certainly didn't exist by the time I got there. 1946 is also important for another reason. From the summer of 1941 to the summer of 1946, the Naval War College was on 2 6-month courses each year instead of the typical 1-year course they had had since I think the 1880s when the college was established. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox in the summer of 1941 ordered the Naval War College to go to 6-month courses in order to cycle more naval officers through the War College. In particular, and this changed the mission significantly, naval reserve officers who had to be taught the fundamentals of naval warfare. With the buildup for the war and the expansion during the war itself, there were thousands and thousands of additional naval officers, 75% of whom were reservists, didn't know a great deal about the Navy. There were also Army officers who had to interact with the Navy, some State Department personnel, and allied military officers. And so instead of educating and training mid-grade naval officers for flag rank responsibilities for 5 years, the Naval War College really had this fundamentally different mission with teaching the fundamentals of naval warfare. So in the summer of 46, they are back to a full year curriculum. They are back to a student body that is not entirely, but now predominantly again, naval officers. There are some senior lieutenant commanders and junior full commanders who make up what's called the junior class. There are then senior full commanders and junior captains who make up what is called the senior class, junior and senior. The junior class students in their war games will carry out what are called exercises. And these are usually tactical exercises, movements of ships and planes. Whereas the senior class, will carry out what are called operations problems, which are much more in-depth, strategic kinds of problems to solve. I think today we would probably call them operational rather than strategic, but they really didn't use that level of warfare at this time. In fact, they divided things between tactical and what they called quote unquote strategical. That was the actual term they used at this time. Also, the Naval War College is still the Navy's premier graduate institution, but it's going to lose ground quickly in the Cold War to what during the war was started as the Armed Forces Staff College, and by 1946 is called the National War College, now the National Defense University. This is really going to become the premier graduate institution for the military. More and more officers are going to go there as the services are unified into a Department of Defense. And the Naval War College is going to lose clout to some extent in that regard. Also, we have a new president of the college in 1946. Vice Admiral Pye retires on the 1st of March. He is replaced by Admiral Raymond Spruance, one of the premier commanders from the Pacific War. Spruance had succeeded Admiral Chester Nimitz in late November 1945 as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but he'd only stayed there about 9 weeks. When Nimitz became Chief of Naval Operations in mid-December, he very quickly started to have Spruance prepare for a move to Newport. He wanted Spruance taking over the presidency of the Naval War College because he knew that the Navy had to reorient itself from the Pacific to the Atlantic in order to start figuring out how to confront the Soviet Union. This was a major, no pun intended, sea change for the U.S. Navy, because for the past 40 years, its primary theater had been the Pacific. Its primary hypothetical enemy had been Japan. That was the theater it was very familiar with. In order to carry out this pivot to the Atlantic, Spruance wanted his box of brains. He wanted his brain in Newport, and that was Raymond Spruance. This would be Spruance's last tour in the Navy before retirement. It was his 4th tour at the Naval War College. He was a student, then an instructor, then a department head, and now the president. That, by the way, would kill your career today in any of the services. It would be called homesteading in the Navy. But in 1946, you could do it, especially if you're Raymond Spruance. And Spruance is going to actually carry on what Pi started, which was not only the study of logistics as the next major realm of for the next major war, but also anything that could be studied about atomic weaponry, and obviously anything about the Soviet Union. So the students each year did thesis topics, and in 45, 46, not surprisingly, the thesis topic is U.S.-Russian relations. In 46, 47, the thesis topic is going to be atomic weapons and their role in future naval warfare. And Spruance is going to do his best to get information to the staff and the students about Hiroshima, about Nagasaki, and about Operation Crossroads, the U.S.'s atomic bomb tests on American, German, and Japanese naval vessels at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in July of 1946. Pi had been trying to get nuclear information, atomic information to his staff and students, not very successfully. Spruance is going to be a little more successful, not much. That information was kept very, very tight. But that is going to be the attempt. There are still going to be a few Army officers, and there are even going to be a couple of State Department Foreign Service officers, because again, the whole idea is jointness. And in fact, the National War College is established at this time on the idea of a joint, a more joint, coordinated national security establishment. Go ahead with the next slide if you don't mind. So, I was able to visit the Naval War College around, I think it was around 2012 or 2013, and I was shown with all the screens blanked out where they conduct the exercises and the operations problems. Very, very different. And I know the photo's a little grainy and a little small, and I apologize for that. But this is the maneuver room of Pringle Hall. And it's basically like one big basketball arena with squares on the deck. And you can see that the way they had to do things in this very analog atmosphere is they had to string off sections, the blue section, the purple section, for instance. They put up curtain sheets for one side to hide what they were doing. They had small model ships and planes. They used, I think, cotton to simulate smoke, including damaged smoke from damage to ships, and things like that to simulate waves and spray and all kinds of things. So if you can imagine doing this before computers, before electronics, which doesn't really come to the Navy and the Naval War College until about the mid to late 1950s in any form. It doesn't really become what we would recognize as modern computers until probably sometime in the 1960s. There were maneuver rules. The exercises and operations problems were collectively called maneuvers, and there were maneuver rules for everything. There were maneuver rules for moving ships and planes, including submarines. There were maneuver rules for amphibious assaults. There were maneuver rules for gunfire, for torpedo fire, whether from surface ships, aircraft, or submarines. There were rules for damage. In fact, there were officers who were detailed to supervise these maneuver rules. There was a director of the maneuver, and he was basically in charge of everything. There were assistant directors for blue and for purple. And then there were umpires. And just to give you an idea of what these umpires were doing, there was a move umpire, right, who ruled about whether certain moves could be made or not. There was a communication umpire, an air umpire, a submarine umpire, a torpedo umpire, a gunfire umpire, and they all had assistant umpires. And these were very often staff, but sometimes they were students who were just back from the Pacific or the Atlantic, very, very experienced, usually captains. Usually the students were the assistant umpires. There was a historian who recorded the history of the maneuver, which was literally, right, blue did this in plot 1, purple did this in plot 3. There was a damage recorder who had damaged computers. These were not machines. These were people. Just like the women who first started using typewriters in the 1870s were called typewriters, these officers were called computers, and there was a chief damage computer along with all of his assistants. And it was, for the most part, his. I encountered one female lieutenant who I think was an instructor. There were the secretaries were female. There was one female plotter assistant, but this was overwhelmingly a male environment. The rules themselves, again, there were rules for everything, and everything was filled out by maneuver cards, and everything was governed by things like fire effect tables for the effect of gunfire and torpedo fire, bomb damage, aerial torpedo damage, submarine torpedo damage. There were rules for weather. There were rules for making smoke. There were rules for above water damage and underwater damage. There were aviation flight forms to record any moves made with aircraft. Gunfire sheets, torpedo fire cards, anything and everything you can imagine. There were rules for recording any kind of damage from gunfire, torpedoes, mines, depth charges, aerial bombs, rockets, and machine gun and cannon fire. And there was a great deal of attention given to gunfire, and I'll explain that a little later. Go ahead with the next slide, if you don't mind, Greg. So this is an example of an exercise. So this is something that would have been carried out by the junior class. And it's an air search plan. And that's what the junior class were given. They were given air search plans to plan and carry out. Or sometimes they were given, they were told to plan out a communication exercise or a movement exercise. So they were moving a group of ships and or a group of planes from one place of the Pacific to another. And these have been very typical the year before. They were fairly typical in this time period. In fact, I have to add that when I got into the book, I decided to focus on the Pacific because I wanted to, even though the Navy was switching to the Atlantic as its primary theater, I wanted to see what they were planning for what had been their primary theater in the past. So I stayed pretty much to 1946. And I never thought I would write a huge book. It is a huge book. It's several hundred pages. I never thought I'd write a long book that covered just 4 months. But that's essentially what I covered, is 4 months of 1946. Early 47, they were focused on the Atlantic, up around the Arctic Circle. That would have been an entirely different book. But in this particular air search plan, there is a Western Pacific Power called black, color-coded black, that's threatening the Panama Canal. And the students have to figure out not only an air search plan, but a fighter direction plan, an intercept plan, and the task force dispositions for how to deal with black. black before the war, in fact, black, at least up through World War I, was usually Imperial Germany. Since Germany doesn't have a navy by 1946, you're using the color code for something else. There was also a plan where orange is still the enemy and blue is going to strike Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, which the Navy actually did in February 1944. In this scenario, blue intends to actually carry out an amphibious assault and invade and take Truk Atoll, which the Navy decided not to. But the junior class needs to deal with whatever orange air and surface forces are going to come out and engage them. I'll go ahead with the next slide. Again, I apologize that these are so small, but one can only do so much. So this is one of the first ones, Operations Problem 2 on the purple side. Remember, purple is the Soviet Union, and here the scenario is the Soviets are going to invade from Kamchatka. Can we zoom in? Oh yeah, that's much better. They're going to invade from Kamchatka and the Soviet Far East Maritime provinces toward the Aleutians and try to take the Aleutians, perhaps even perhaps attack Alaska, but try to invade and occupy the Aleutians, like the Japanese did in part in 1942. And so, what's this kind of scenario? Well, first, a little bit of context. When I was doing the research for this, the exercises, especially the operations problems where the battles were actually fought out, were very, very heavily surface warfare oriented, very heavily. I'll get into a little more detail a little later, but submarines almost never appeared, and there almost always wound up being a gunfight between blue and orange surface forces, or in this case, blue and purple surface forces. And I couldn't figure this out. I thought this was Spruance and the Black Shoe Gun Club admirals retaking control of things and denying naval aviators their due. However, it slowly dawned on me, and I had a lot of emails with Professor John Hattendorf, who was a professor at Naval War College for 40 years. A lot of emails with him, and then reading some context on this, that what's really going on here is not historically replicating a battle or an engagement of any kind. You can't do that here. Here you're looking into the future. The real purpose of all of this is to educate the students. John would use the word educate. I've been at a community college for nearly 30 years, so I guess I would use the word train. So I'm going to use the word train. The purpose here with the exercises and operations problems is to train the naval officers for flag rank responsibilities by having the staff literally toss them into situations where they're put under stress. I really expected to see scenarios where blue had 15 or 20 fast carriers and the enemy had maybe half that number and got blitzed. I expected to see them doing scenarios that repeated the Pacific War of 1944-45. And instead, what I see are scenarios like this one, where one, there are submarines. Those submarine lines are purple submarines. Why do you have purple submarines? Well, you don't know a lot about the Soviet Navy, but you do know they don't have any aircraft carriers. They don't have a lot in the way of surface ships. In fact, they have a couple of old Tsarist era battleships that are pretty useless. What they do have is something like 212 submarines, about 60 of them stationed in the Pacific. So guess what? They're going to use their submarines as their primary strike weapon. I don't know if the Naval War College is really just guessing at that or getting that from naval intelligence and the Office of Naval Intelligence. maybe has a mole in Soviet naval headquarters in 1946, which is difficult to imagine. I'm guessing they're taking this from German naval doctrine, which talked about using and talked about and practiced using submarines as the primary strike weapon, backed up by land-based naval aviation, and then surface ships like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. And I'm assuming that ONI and then NWC are assuming themselves that the Soviets are simply taking on German naval doctrine. They captured a lot of German naval personnel, they captured a lot of German naval equipment. And so it would make sense, perfect sense, if the Soviets are also seeing submarines as their primary naval strike weapon, which they did, in fact, throughout the Cold War, backed up by land-based naval aviation and then surface ships. The other thing is that they are obviously up in the north. And I started seeing just sort of little hints, which were later confirmed for me by a couple of documents. Um, the I got the impression that they're fighting in this year with surface ships because they are up north, and it is difficult to fly up north in this weather. In fact, I have a colleague who retired from the Navy in 1987. He talked about how in 1986 they were up around Japan. His carrier group was up around Japan. They were trying to get as close to Kamchatka as they could without the Soviets detecting them. It was really bad weather. There was talk about sending an F-14 up to scout, and the admiral commanding the carrier group would not allow an F-14 to launch because of the weather. This was 1986. So if you can imagine how often your aircraft don't work up north, and that your radar may not even work, and your sonar may not even work. And the Americans had a tendency to use, the blue has a tendency in these games to use submarines for other than ship strike, like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or merchant ship attacks, or something like that. So in these scenarios like this one, blue submarines very often weren't available. And you didn't have a lot of aircraft carriers. And this was a carryover from the previous year. Blue and orange typically had 2 to 5 aircraft carriers each, more typically about 2 to 3. Same in this year. Blue and purple each typically have, I mean, in this war game, I think blue has 3 aircraft carriers and purple has 2. It's not these huge numbers that I was expecting. In this scenario, there's land-based air involved. In fact, let's go to the next slide, because I think we can go down to the next one. Take a look at blue for a second. Actually, let's go down one more, I think. 1 second. No, I'm sorry. You know what? I'm sorry, Greg. Go back to the last, to purple again. Yeah. In this scenario where purple is trying to invade the Aleutians and blue is trying to fend them off, they have to deal with the submarine. Blue has to deal with the purple submarines, and again, very small number of purple carriers, 2, I think, 3 on the side of blue. There's also land-based air. However, land-based air doesn't come into the operations problem. Why? Because land-based air, blue versus purple, basically pummeled each other into impotence. In fact, blue has a limited number of atomic bombs that they use on Kamchatka and in other areas of the Soviet Far Eastern provinces. And land-based air has basically pummeled each other into impotence. By the time purple is launching both its covering force and its landing force toward the Aleutians, and blue is launching its defense force to counter, land-based air is no longer a factor in any of this. So little by little, what the staff did is they created scenarios where the two sides were reduced to surface ships. Once you have land-based air on each side pummel each other into impotence, what's the next stage? Well, the next stage is to have the carrier forces do the same thing. And so you have carrier forces attack each other and knock out each other's ships. Not always necessarily sinking them. They emphasized a lot that all that had to be done to an enemy carrier was to knock out the flight deck. And then it was a useless vessel and it had to be taken away. And so you have a scenario here where Purple's two carriers knock out a couple of the blue carriers before they get knocked out. Blue has one carrier left, but there are almost no aircraft left on it. Guess what? It sails back to Seattle because it's no longer of any value. You've reduced and then eliminated carrier air. What are you left with? Surface forces. All right, now I would imagine this scenario and the other ones must have absolutely driven the naval aviators nuts, because they were quickly on the rise in the U.S. Navy. All right, the number of aviation admirals just ballooned in World War II. They were taking up the top spots in a lot of ways, in a lot of places. They assumed they could do anything and everything with their ships, with their planes, I should say. They assumed that they were always being held back by surface officers. So these scenarios, to a great extent, must have really, really driven them nuts. I can just imagine. But in July of '46, there's a short address by Spruance, and he's welcoming the class in. And he's telling them about what they're going to do in general, and he's telling them about how nice Newport is and how they ought to enjoy the year off from sea duty with their families and immerse themselves in their readings, because they're going to read heavily in military history and international relations. They ought to immerse themselves in the lectures and take advantage of the lectures, because the lectures were not only staff members, there were sometimes senior students who were specialists in various areas, and they very often had guest lectures. For instance, if you wanted to hear about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Admiral Thomas Kincaid, the commander of the Eastern Seafront here in New York City, would take the train up to Newport and give a lecture on the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Professor Bernard Brody, who's starting to write his books on atomic warfare, would take the train in from Yale and give lectures. So Spruance is emphasizing to the incoming student officers to enjoy all of these things. And really, it's not a year off, but it's really a year to stretch themselves. His chief of staff, a rear admiral named Alan Smith, followed with another address after Spruance, and he laid out in more detail what they were going to be doing. And one of the first things he told them is, your scenarios are going to be set in the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, in part because of who we're going to be fighting. And I think he even names the Russians, which officers didn't do much in 1946, but he does mention the Russians. And then he tells them specifically, by the way, when it comes to Pacific scenarios, we're not going to do anything in the Central Pacific and the South Pacific. You're all too familiar with those parts of the Pacific. We're going north, where you're not familiar. Again, the purpose is to put these officers under stress and put them in situations where they don't know exactly how to do things and they don't know exactly what to do. And let's see how they think on their feet. Then he tells them, we're doing a lot with surface warfare. No, we're not trying to devalue submarines and naval aviation. But Smith says to them, literally, what do you do if you're up north? Your aircraft don't work, your radar doesn't work, your sonar doesn't work, and you're reduced to guns and torpedoes. How do you deal with the Russians then? And unfortunately, I found those two documents in the National Archives after I'd published these books. For these books, I did my research strictly in the Naval War College archives. I suppose that's a lesson in how not to compartmentalize your research too much. Okay, let's go down one more. I think one more. Yeah, there we go. This is something from the Naval War College, which gives you an idea of the distances um, that had to be dealt with in the Pacific. And again, it's fairly northern oriented, and I just included it. And these problems like Operation 2J, right? So the J indicates this is a junior class exercise. Um, and what they're doing is blue and purple are at war. Uh, Purple is in the process of conquering. Sound familiar? Manchuria, Southern Korea, and North China. They had not been able to invade the Japanese homelands because Blue had bombed Vladivostok and other places with atomic bombs. Um, there is, however, a buildup of purple amphibious shipping, and the Blue commander has to escort a convoy to Japan from Seattle, and then Dutch Harbor to Japan to reinforce them. There are 3 blue battle carriers versus 3 purple battle carriers. Battle carriers are like the Midway class, right? These big carriers that come in right at the end that can carry about 120 or 130 aircraft each. So we're not talking escort carriers like was sometimes the case with Orange the previous year, but there's only 3 on each side. All right. And not surprisingly, what happens? Uh, the 3 on each side get sunk or they get damaged. Not with atomic bombs, but with machine gun and cannon fire, with torpedoes, um, and they're either sunk or their flight decks are knocked out. And that, by the way, was wartime U.S. Navy doctrine. Either sink or knock out the carriers first, then you can go after battleships and other heavy surface forces. So once the 3 and the 3 are expended, what are you left with? There are no submarines around. You're left with your battleships, your battle cruisers, your heavy and light cruisers, and your destroyers. Um, and are there are there any atomic bombs around? No, Blue has used its limited number of atomic bombs on the Soviet Union. The Soviets don't have atomic bombs yet. In fact, the Blue convoy commander is bringing fresh atomic bombs from Seattle to Japan in order to replenish Blue Army Air Force's land-based units with A bombs. Um, and with those A bombs, Blue is going to try to either deter or bomb Purple and prevent them from invading the Japanese home islands. So again, one of the scenarios here. Um, and since it is Purple you're fighting, you have to try to take into account submarine attacks, because Purple is going to use its submarines as its primary strike weapon, uh, along with land-based naval aviation and whatever surface ships it has. Go ahead to the next one if you don't mind. Yes, operations problem 3 is a senior class version of 1J. So again, Purple is invading and occupying these areas of East Asia, trying to threaten the Japanese home islands. Blue is defending by reinforcing from Seattle to Dutch Harbor and other parts of the Aleutian Islands, and then the Japanese home islands themselves. And the difference with operations problem 3, maybe because it was a senior class problem, there was a history of the maneuver. A lot of these, not all of these games had histories of the maneuver where you could look at how things were plotted out move by move. But this was one that did. Go ahead. I think what should be the last slide. I think that's the last one. So this is a typical interwar, wartime, and immediate post-war naval formation. which both the junior and senior classes practiced in their exercises and operations problems. And if you will notice, folks, down at the bottom of the blue sheet, there are a couple of fleet carriers, and they are guarded and screened by 4 destroyers. And then in the middle, there are the battleships. And then you have cruisers and destroyers and a couple of battle cruisers out in the vanguard. And with some minor differences, this was fairly typical of what the Navy was doing in the interwar period when the carriers weren't that capable, when there weren't that many of them, when their aircraft weren't that capable, when they couldn't really defend themselves, it was thought, even during the day, certainly not at night. Navy, interestingly enough, as carrier focused as it became during the war, continued this kind of doctrine throughout the Pacific War, especially when they were cruising at night. In fact, I've digitized my records, and unfortunately, in digitizing, I've lost one source. I mean, it's in there somewhere, but I can't find it. But it's a naval officer who talks about, I think it's Arleigh Burke, who talks about, and paraphrasing, but he says, of course, we kept the battleships out in front. Okay, not in the center, but out in front. We wanted the Japanese carrier planes to hit them as soon as the combat air patrol had finished working them over. They were so heavily armored and had so many anti-aircraft guns, we wanted the Japanese carrier planes to hit them before they hit the carriers. Oh, and by the way, we kept the battleships out at night in case we ran into Japanese surface forces. Lesson being, if you're fighting a fleet that has heavy surface forces, contrary to the mythology that battleships become useless on late on the morning of December 7th, 1941, if you're fighting another fleet that has heavy surface forces, you better have some heavy surface forces. Carrier planes at this time, for the most part, can't fly at night. And they certainly can't fight much at night, even when they can fly. And they can't deal with battleships and other heavy surface forces, which means your carriers are really fair game. And remember, in these scenarios, you don't have a lot of carriers. Those 2 down at the bottom are fairly typical. All right. By the way, why don't you have a lot of carriers? Well, it took me a while to figure this out, and I never encountered any documentary evidence, so I'm just kind of assuming here, but I think I'm on fair ground with this guesstimation. When I looked at all the war games from 1945 to 46 against Orange, and then all the ones from 46, from the fall of 46 against Purple, even though the settings weren't always in the South Pacific, the previous year they were often in the Central Pacific, this year they were in the North Pacific, they all looked really, really, really similar to several 1942 battles between the US and the Japanese. In particular, Coral Sea, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and the naval battle of Guadalcanal. They all seemed very, very similar to 1942, when the US did not have a large number of carriers, when the number of carriers on each side was fairly similar, as it was in all of those, until you get to the naval battle of Guadalcanal, when each side barely has 1 carrier each, and they're not really engaging those remaining carriers in battle. Naval battle of Guadalcanal wound up being a surface battle to a great extent, because that's about all each side had left by that time. What's the scenario of repeating 1942-like battles? Well, you can't predict the future. It's really difficult, I can tell you as a practicing historian. But you do have these battles where it wasn't certain the US would win. And officers, senior officers commanding, had to be really, really careful with their scarce resources, like their carriers. What a great situation, what a great scenario to put these officers into, these student officers, and put them under stress. No, I'm not giving you 20 fast carriers. I'm giving you 4 or 3 or 2. And that's all you've got. There's nothing else. There's nothing coming from CONUS to reinforce you. And if you lose these, you have to make do with whatever you have. What a great way to see which of these, especially which of these commanders and captains in the senior class, can really think on their feet and maybe really be material for flag rank. And again, try to guess what the Soviets are going to do, because I do think they're probably guessing. I'd be shocked to find that Office of Naval Intelligence had a mole in Soviet naval headquarters in 1945 and 1946. Maybe, but I kind of doubt it. Is there one more slide, Greg? I think. Yeah. Oh, this is the U.S. That's Midway, one of the battle carriers. It's now in San Diego as a museum. Here it is in March 1946. It is up in the north of the Pacific. It's in an operation called Frostbite. They're testing to see how carriers can operate, how aircraft can operate up north. And guess what they find out? The planes can only fly about 50% of the time. That's probably a really optimistic estimate in March. So, how do you deal with atomic weapons? How do you deal with a submarine-focused enemy? Because remember, it's the British who primarily fight the German Navy. I mean, the U.S. Navy is there, it's helping, but that's not the U.S. Navy's primary focus in World War II. Now, fighting a submarine-equipped Navy, a submarine-focused Navy is going to have to be. How do you do all of this and up around the Arctic Circle, whether it's Kamchatka and the Aleutians on the one hand, or Greenland and Iceland on the other? So that's all I've got. I've probably gone a little over and talked too much, but we can open it up to questions now.
No, that's perfect. You're fine, Hal. There's already a number of questions in the queue. The first one asks about the nuclear armament of American submarines. When would that, when did that occur, and did that change the teaching methods at all?
Is this well, if the assumption here is ballistic missile armed nuclear submarines, the first one doesn't do a deterrent patrol until December 1959.
Got it.
Those are not. I mean, we don't have the Nautilus until 1954, and we don't have boomers until 1959. They start being developed in 1955. However, OPNAV, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, and their strategic plans section, they're already talking about not really nuclear powered submarines, but in 1946, they're talking about Soviet submarines that can fire rockets at the continental United States.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that technology doesn't exist, but they're analyzing scenarios where it will in the future.
We got a few around that. Charles asked, why did the Navy think the Russians wanted to invade Japan?
Because if the U.S. has control of the Japanese home islands, the assumption on the part of the U.S. is it can use its superior air and naval power to contain the Soviets to mainland East Asia. And, fairly typical strategic scenario. If you're the expanding power, you want to expand more. If you're the containing power, you want to contain. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff always saw, I mean, from the end of the war on, always saw control of the Japanese home islands as its primary strategic base complex in the Western Pacific.
Tom asked about the Russian Navy. I think you touched on this, but specifically, what assumptions were made about their carrier capabilities?
They have none. They're probably not going to have any, but you never know, because Stalin's intent in the 1930s on building a big surface fleet. He's intent after 1945 on resuming that. Stalin has a knack for carrying off a lot of things. What if he does build a big surface fleet, and what if it starts to include aircraft carriers? That doesn't happen, obviously. They have helicopter carriers in the 60s and the 70s. They don't really have an aircraft carrier until the 1980s. It doesn't last very long. It winds up being a rusty hulk that's now part of, unfortunately, the Chinese Navy, unfortunately for the U.S. And not much in the way of surface ships, mainly cruisers and destroyers, a lot of motor torpedo boats, a lot of river and coastal craft, and then a lot of submarines.
Um,
Yeah.
Next question, what assumptions were made about the Allies, particularly UK and Australia?
Yeah, it doesn't really come in to the Navy, but I can speak to that a little bit because there's a Naval War College historian named Stephen Ross who did a couple of books on JCS war plans. The assumption is that the assumption really is the Soviets are 10 feet tall
Mm,
and that they are going to be able to conquer most, if not all, of Eurasia. And so, for instance, in Europe, the U.S. and its allies are going to be driven down to maybe the southern half of the Italian peninsula, if that. Probably be driven off of Western Europe. Um, England's going to become the unsinkable aircraft carrier. You're gonna lose Southern Korea and China, at least by 46, 47. You're assuming that, and you're gonna try to hold on to the UK and the Japanese home islands until, guess what, reinforcements can arrive from the United States and you can reinvade Western Europe. If all of this sounds like World War II repeat, that's what JCS plans were essentially between 45 and 50. They were essentially World War II repeated with the Soviets as the enemy and the US having atomic weapons.
mm,
And there wasn't a whole lot of difference between World War II scenarios.
mm. Jim asked, could you talk about any assumptions where they completely misread the Soviet forces and any assumptions you thought they were very prescient about? You were surprised at how spot on they were.
Yeah, I would say more spot on than not. I mean, if even if you're guessing that the Soviet Navy is primarily going to be a submarine navy, guess what? I mean, it is until the 1960s, 1970s. I mean, they don't really have much of a surface force until the 1960s, and really not until the 1970s. Um, they have land-based naval aviation, so the Naval War College was on target there, or OPNAV was, giving intelligence to the Naval War College. Um, where they got things wrong, my focus admittedly was so narrow, both in geographic scope and in chronology. I didn't see a lot that they got wrong. I mean, they got it wrong that there were going to be 1942 like battles in the future. They got that wrong. But I'm not sure they were trying to get that right. I think they were using the 1942 like scenarios again for pedagogical purposes. They were putting these officer students under stress. They were throwing them curveballs. So I think they actually got a lot right, even though they were using old kinds of scenarios.
Mm, interesting. Another question about Korea, specifically, what assumptions were they making about any type of breakout of war or hostilities in Korea?
In this time period, there were none.
Yeah.
And if you think about even at the JCS level from 45 to 50, where does Korea fit in? I mean, at the end of the war, we have two infantry divisions in occupation of Southern Korea. Well, by I think 1946 or 1947, it's down to one infantry division. By 1948, it's down to no infantry divisions. There's a military advisory group. In fact, in 1948 or 49, the JCS are talking about withdrawing this 600-man military advisory group. And the assumption, especially on the part of the Navy and the Air Force, is Southern Korea can't be held. The Army had different ideas, but Southern Korea can't be held. It's going to fall to the Soviets or the Soviets, Chinese, North Korean monolith. And you're not going to try to defend it. You're
Mm,
going to withdraw those forces. You're not going to strand them like the forces in the Philippines were. So there's very little mention of Korea. And I wouldn't expect that from the Naval War College, before 1950. So no, they weren't guessing right with a Korean War scenario, but then nobody was. And frankly, no one's really guessing about no one's got the Korean War scenario right until Harry Truman 5 days after the North Korean invasion says, "Hey, we're going to back up the South Koreans." I don't think anybody in the military was
mm,
expecting that. Okay, we'll use our air and naval forces to cover withdrawal of ground forces, and that'll be about it. Yeah.
that's interesting. We'll take one more here. Charles asked about the establishment of the U.S. Air Force in late 1947. was this factored into the 46 gaming on the period you just discussed?
Yeah, I think only to the extent that you had Blue Army Air Force's land-based aviation units and that they were equipped with atomic bombs, because it is 46 and the only atomic units are B-29 units with Nagasaki type bombs. In fact, I think the only AAF unit was the 509th Bomb Group, the one that did the strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There were no war games yet where the Navy's envisioning having aircraft carriers that could launch aircraft that could drop tactical nuclear weapons.
Mm.
That now, I'd have to look at the dates. That's something that OpNav, OpNav's strategic plans section, for instance, is probably experimenting with or trying to analyze by about 1947, 1948, 1949. And of course, they're drawing up the USS United States, which is supposed to be a massive aircraft carrier that can carry aircraft that can carry small atomic bombs. Um, but I think that's more at the design and theoretical level. So if it's not operational, it hasn't really gotten to the Naval War College yet.
Hmm, fascinating.
I can take other questions if you want.
Um, see if we have any more in the queue here. I think that's it. Let me double check. I think that's it, Hal.
Okay.
Um, but yeah,
Well, just one thing on the publications. Again, I don't know if people like or dislike PDFs. I've gotten used to them teaching online. The PDFs for the trilogy are free. Okay. Now, if you hate PDFs and you really need you need a hard copy book, you're perfectly welcome to spend $69 on each book, hard copy, from the Naval War College Press. But since these are all public domain and they're all from the government printing office, they are all available electronically for absolute free. All you have to do is get in the Naval War College, the Naval War College Press's website, and you'll find them. Don't worry, there are no royalties. So you're not robbing the Friedman family of retirement income or anything like that. And if you want to look at what I'm doing recently, because this book did come out in 2017, it's been a while. What I'm doing recently is publishing online with an outfit out of Michigan State University. That's MSU, the University of Michigan, not that other place in Ann Arbor that pirated Navy colors over 200 years ago. It's an online repository called Knowledge Commons. I think the way it works is that if you go into www.hcommons.org and type my name in, my profile will come up, and you will see 10 articles that I've posted over the last few months, having to deal with the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, and the strategic planning they're doing from 45 to 47. I'm preparing a monograph right now for publication there. That's my publication from now on. And Knowledge Commons is free. You can download things, I think. It is strictly online. But I've ceased publishing conventionally because I'm tired of the peer review and editing processes from the presses and the publishing houses. So there you can find my latest work, and there'll be a lot more added because I did a ton of research before COVID hit at the National Archives, and have quite a bit of material built up ready to analyze.
That's great, Hal. There are actually, I'm sorry, a few more came in the queue as you.
Sure. Yep. No
Ron,
problem.
many of these students went on to Major Command.
I don't know how many, but there was at least one. The senior class had a Captain Claude Ricketts, and Claude Ricketts became a commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and I think he became a chief of naval operations, and had a guided missile destroyer named after him in the 1960s. And I would guess there were others like that. I didn't really do much of a name search. I mean, I named students when they were doing things, just like I named instructors when they were lecturing or doing things. Um, but didn't didn't notice. I mean, there wasn't a Hyman Rickover because he was already doing atomic things. Um, but I would imagine most of them probably went on to flag rank because that's who went to the Naval War College, were the commanders and the captains who'd been pegged for flag rank. So
Um,
I'd be surprised if most of these individuals didn't wind up as admirals.
yeah, that makes total sense. Reed writes, arguably the Pacific War was a matter of Marines taking islands as land-based aircraft carriers, question mark. No scenarios repeating this, question mark. Was it because the US was the containing force?
No, not a lot of the detail was on naval warfare itself. Um, there were convoys they were guarding, convoys that held amphibious assault troops, very often Army, sometimes Marine Corps. The students got lectures on amphibious assaults from Marine Corps officers who commanded in the Pacific. But yeah, the war games themselves didn't include a lot of that. Um, I don't know if the Marines were doing that at the Marine Corps Command and General Staff College at this time. If there, I would have to check and see when the Marines started establishing, and they certainly had Marine Corps schools. So I don't know what they were doing in this time period. That potentially might be another one of my projects, is to get down to the archive at Quantico,
Mm.
and what was the impact of the Pacific War on the post-war Marines. And I have some of that material from OpNav, um, but there was very little of it here. This was very ship focused. So maybe the Marines in the class, there were always a couple of them. Maybe they were pulling their remaining hair out of their head too, because again, it was very surface warfare oriented.
Yeah.
Um,
How another question about how explicitly they adjusted for the Arctic weather relative to the Pacific in World War II. What assumptions did they make in terms of, I guess, success ratios here? He writes firepower.
it was ever present. Not only assuming your aircraft can't fly a lot, but literally taking into account what's the temperature, how are the guns and torpedoes going to operate, how's the radar going to operate, if it will, um, how do you position your ships so that, I mean, literally, even though these are self-propelled ships, right? How do you position your ships so that the sun and the clouds and the currents and the ocean spray are assisting you in your gun and torpedo fire. So, I mean, they did that a lot the last year in the Central Pacific. They were doing even more of it here because of the climate and the weather they knew they were going to encounter.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That is all we have in the queue.
Okay.
Thank you again to our speaker, Hal Friedman, for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Blue versus Purple, the U.S. Naval War College, the Soviet Union, and the New Enemy in the Pacific. As Hal pointed out, you can download the PDF for free. It's in the public domain. I put a link in the chat. Please join us this Saturday, October 18th at 1 p.m. when Tim Bouvier will discuss his new book, Allies at War, How the Struggles Between the Allied Powers Shaped the War and the World, which invites readers into the rooms where the critical decisions were made and goes beyond the confines of the Grand Alliance to examine, among other topics, the doomed Anglo-French partnership and the fractious relationship between General Charles de Gaulle and the Free French, and as well as interactions with Poland, Greece, Spain, and neutral Ireland, Yugoslavia, and nationalist China. I think
Hmm.
he's covered just about every political
Yeah.
dynamic that
Yeah.
or the publicist did. But Hal, great to see you again. This is your third time. Feel free to come back again. It sounds like you've got another good one in the works,
Yeah.
and we'd love to have you back. And until then,
Okay.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.